are. La, la, la. It is 2:02, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the learning with you all. Don't forget, you can find the PowerPoint and all the materials under Coaches Network meetings. Katie always does an awesome job of getting everything linked in advance of the meeting so that you could follow along if you so choose. This afternoon, we're going to spend some time talking about the intersection between equity and PBIS. As I hope that you guys are heading into planning and thinking about what next year will be, we thought it would be helpful to walk through some of the tools available to us from the center. While we're introducing ourselves, if you would take time to drop into chat your name, your role, and the school or district from which you're coming to visit us today. I am Trish Schroed. I'm the Director of Research Naval, and I'm going to be leading this initial conversation about equity, but my friends that are here with me today will be helping, monitoring chat, dropping links. So I'll let them introduce themselves and then we'll jump in this morning or this afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Katie Pullman. None of us want to go first. So I'm Katie Pullman. I'm a Technical Assistance Director with Midwest PBIS and happy to see so many familiar faces. I can't talk this afternoon. I'll pass it over to Amy.
Hi, everyone. Amy Flamini. Nice to see everybody. It's nice and sunny here in Springfield, Illinois. I hope that you are getting some sun wherever you are. So appreciate seeing everybody on the call today. I'll pass it over to Diane.
I am Diane LeMaster. Great to see everybody, recognize Julie and Alan and some familiar faces. So nice to see you guys. Sun is shining here too. And I actually got out at lunch and walked around the block and it was really kind of nice. A little windy, but the sun is awesome. So nice to see everybody and happy to spend the next couple hours with you.
Perfecto. So we're going to spend a little time connecting. We're going to talk about forum review and how equity fit into the forum and what resources are available to you all based on that work. We'll transition into the equity work group, the people behind the scenes from the center that are working fast and furiously to produce resources to help your practice. We're going to unpack those guides, including the culturally responsive field guide. I know that there are so many amazing resources that come via the center, as well as newsletters and etc. And sometimes we just start the school year and get overwhelmed, and even unpacking those amazing resources become, a burden, it almost feels like. And so I want to take some time to unpack them briefly, do a little book talk, see which ones might be helpful to your practice. We'll do a breakout room for you guys to look at them together and come up with some ideas. And then we'll go into our technical assistance time. So I want to start out by having you grab a pen or a pencil, whatever writing utensil is handy. And I really want you to take the next 2 minutes, and I will be quiet, I promise, to jot down people within your school community that you depend on. And as you're thinking about them, I want you to actually write down the individual and the thing that they did recently that was helpful to your practice. So it is 2:05. We're going to take till 2:07. Just jot down the people in your life that have contributed to your practice. Now, if you would take time to pick one of the people that you wrote down, one, circle that person, and then the ask is that you reach out to that person this week to thank them for their contribution to your work, right? This is that time of year when we come back from spring break where it doesn't feel like sometimes we're going to make it till the end of the year, right? And those people that you work with that help contribute to your practice, it's a beautiful time of year because they're in that same place, right? Where they're struggling, counting down the days possibly. And it always is helpful, not only to them, but to ourselves to express our gratitude. So my ask from you is to take one person off your list to commit to, and if you would commit by dropping their name in the chat, you don't have to share what they did, drop their name in the chat and then commit to this week. We have a whole, 5 days in front of us to share with them how they supported your practice. Okay, are we good? We're going to start dropping their names in the chat. So while you're dropping your names in the chat and circling your person that you're going to reach out and express your gratitude to, we'll discuss our learning objectives for today. Our hope is that you walk away from this time with us having developed facilitation skills, a plan, if you will, for working with the adults in your organization. As part of that, adding to your toolkit, we're going to review several resources that are available to your practice, which include forum sessions that occurred just in October, especially aligned to culturally responsiveness and equity. Given the news that we continue to watch each night, it's such an important and relevant bucket of work, if you will. We're going to talk about the ongoing resources that have been available from the center outside of the forum. And we're actually, as I said, sometimes it can just feel overwhelming even to unpack those very rich documents. So we're going to do a book walk, if you will, through those documents to see which of them you think would help benefit your practice. We'll take a little time in our breakouts to unpack them a little more. It's TFI season. So we're assessing where we are in relation to where we want to be and getting ready to plan with our teams for how we get that much better next year. So a totally appropriate time to review resources. And then we'll talk about, again, data, evaluating our practice and setting goals for our ongoing improvement. So as I mentioned, you cannot turn on the news these days without thinking about this work around equity. And so we really wanted to make this a thoughtful conversation with you, given our current context, right? We faced the last year of the triple trauma, if you will, of the pandemic, social unrest, fallout from the election, and it certainly has drawn attention to the need for us to address equity and disproportionality. And given our life's work, if you will, thinking through the lens of Pbis. So certainly last year's forum, and this isn't the first year that equity has been a strand, but there were several resources that I know will be helpful to your practice if you're working on equity and disproportionality. If we look at this slide, and if you've downloaded the PowerPoint for today, you already realize that these are hot linked. All the slides almost have links to other documents. And so if you hover over Keynote or equitable learning environments, et cetera, you'll see that the video, so the actual live recording of that session from the forum is already up on the web page, organized for your use, as well as the handouts. So if in your district, you're working on, say, embedding culturally responsive practice within an MTSS Pbis framework, certainly you could watch the video from D3, beginning to embed culturally responsive practice, and then maybe decide on short snippets of that video that might be helpful for the ongoing conversations with the adult learners in your organization, as well as grab the handouts, look and see if there are slides that are helpful to your practice, right? That's why we publish everything, so that it's available for you. We're all good teachers together, so we share with each other the resources that are available. So obviously the keynote by George Shagai was focused on equity implementation. His handouts are linked. A1, which was that first day breakout, Black Lives Matter and a just equitable learning environment. etc. So the videos and the handouts are there. I'm hopeful that they will be helpful to your practice. In addition, there is an entire work group of some pretty heavy hitters in this field from the center. So you might notice the name Tamika LaSalle, which was one of the presenters at the forum last year, as well as Ruthie Payno-Simmons and Jennifer Rose. Obviously, Dr. Kent McIntosh is there. He's been leading so much of the work around React. So how do we embed equity within a PBIS framework? They continue to work and develop theoretical frames as well as installation and demonstration sites to kind of test out the theories around how we do a better job of being equitable in our practices. And they continue to work, and some obviously some of the work that we're going to unpack today together comes from the work of this work group. So when we think about how we can improve all student outcomes, especially students who come from underrepresented groups, our assertion would be that you do that through embedding culturally responsive practice into PBIS practices. So PBIS is the framework, no matter whether you're installing restorative practices, trauma-informed practices, growth mindset, all of those things are not a replacement from PBIS, right? Those are practices that help build the toolkit of our adult learners so that they can meet the needs of all learners within your MTSS system. And as we think about this, again, I mentioned it's TFI season. My good friend Diane Lemaster, who is our data guru, right, is always there to reinforce our learning around TFI. But our assertion would be, and the research would bear out the idea, that if we're not implementing all components that are necessary for a Fidelidous implementation of PBIS, we will not get the benefits for all of our learners, right? You can't just have a team that meets. You can't just have 10-year-old expectations up on the wall, right? You have to have agreed upon practices for all the adults. Once they are identified, we have to then teach them in an ongoing way. So we have to have that representative team. In fact, when we look at the culturally responsive field guide, it's going to give us some really nice practices. So if this is an area of growth when we take the TFI, there's going to be some examples of things how we could improve what our stakeholder voice surrounding our teams, as well as thinking through those expectations. Many of you, obviously, as you're applying for recognition and badges, right? Many of you have updated your expectations this year, but that should not be a one and done, right? We're not laminating things and putting them on the wall where they're never touched again. This is an ongoing process. But we do know that when the adults in our organization agree to our expectations and define our rules and routines, we give a safe, predictable environment for our students. And now more than ever, that safety, predictability is so important. But we can't just agree to them as adults, right? We have to actively teach them and reinforce them, because through reinforcement, we develop the relationships that are absolutely necessary. But we also have to have a response when kids don't get it right away, right? How do we engage in that growth mindset? We're just not there yet. How do we use our restorative practices as strategies to improve relationships and rapport? And how do we gather data to help us make better decisions, including fidelity data this time of year? So as I mentioned, it is the TFI season, right? And I just want to give a cautionary tale, and I'm sure not you're all doing this, but I have heard many schools, as we work with them through the recognition process, express concern because their scores on the TFI are not maybe as high as they have been in years past. But that is anyone surprised that in the middle of the triple trauma of the pandemic, et cetera, that we've had to regroup a lot. And so your planning is only as good as your data, right? And so I would just encourage you to be as accurate as you can be. And there is no shame. It's a judgment-free zone, right? If your scores on sections of the TFI are not where they used to be, because we've undergone such massive change this year. But ultimately, we all understand, because you guys are all well-versed in the PBIS system, right? Is that PBIS is really about adult behavior and changes in your adult systems that help get kids better access to good outcomes, right? So having good TFI data as part of your system to plan for the coming school year, along with the resources that we're going to share with you today, are really important. And when we talk about teaching, I just always want to remind, right, that behaviors are the prerequisites for academics, and that we're creating a structured environment for kids. But ultimately, repetition is key. I want you to remember the last time you tried to learn something new, right? A new skill. Or harder yet, to unlearn a previously learned behavior and garner a new one, right? So we know this research. If you've ever been in Tier 1 training with us, you know that for a child to learn something new, we have to give them X number of iterations of practice. For adults, we have to give more iterations of practice, right? And for kids to unlearn and relearn a behavior. So the data out of Joyce and Showers tells us that if a child is to learn a new skill, that means they don't already have a skill in place, right? They need 8 iterations of practice. Adults, no one will be surprised, need 25 iterations of practice. How many staff meetings do you have a year? Yeah, right? So like, if we're asking adults, if we see something amazing in any of the products that we're going to look at today, please be mindful of giving adults X number of iterations of practice. So that's why PD has to be ongoing, right? And this research out of Joyce and Showers actually says, if you want an adult to engage in a new practice or skill, they need 25 iterations of practice over an 8 to 10 week period of time. And that's why it's so important that these aren't one and done presentations at the beginning of our year, but this is an ongoing process that our team helps all of our learners walk through together, getting the level of support. I love when Katie always reminds us, right? What are we doing for all, few, and some, right? And that's not just our kids, but also our adults. Because if kids need 25 or 28 iterations of practice to lose an old skill and pick up a new one, imagine how many iterations of practice I need, or Missy needs, or Diane needs, because our practices have become so ingrained to who we are. It's really hard to drop an old and pick up a new. And when we're talking about disproportionality, right? If disproportionality was an easy fix, we would have fixed it by now, right? But it is a complex problem that we're facing as school systems, and it's really impacted. And I'm sure that we haven't even hit on all of them, but the root causes of disproportionality really lie in multiple avenues, which is why the problem of disproportionality is so complex. And it's why the work group has spent so much time trying to develop resources that would be helpful to our practice. So here are 5, and these are the ones that we're going to unpack briefly together today. They are linked in your PowerPoint, but I wanted to do a book talk, right? Because again, sometimes we get these amazing resources in the coach's corner or in a social media post, but some of them, like the Coachly Responsive Field Guide, are really lengthy and they have a lot of links in them, and they would be amazing. But who else has a whole list of things that they need to read and just haven't had time to get to, right? So the first one we're going to talk about, and you'll have time if you so choose to go into this breakout, is examples of engaging instruction to increase equity in education. This one has actually been out there for a while. You'll notice the publication date is September 2015. I included this one especially because I've been hearing from a lot of you all in schools that engagement is a huge area of need this year. It's always important, but this year more than ever, engagement has been on the forefront of many of your work. So inside this this publication, you'll see them talk about and give examples around explicit instruction, building and priming background knowledge. So not just building, but how do we prime that background knowledge to get ready for learning? I love bullet 3. It's in our classroom practices, right? How do we increase opportunities to respond? And then how do we provide that ongoing performance feedback? We think about feedback all the time when we're talking about academics, but this one really pushes us to think about that ongoing feedback kids need as they're trying to pick up new practices within the classroom, new skills, behavioral academic skills within the classroom. We're also going to have available for you to go and have a conversation, that 5-point intervention approach to enhancing equity in school discipline. So this one is really about how do we disaggregate our data to know who Pbis is working for and who it's not working for. Talking about building our MTSS framework so that it's preventative and culturally responsive. We hear culturally responsive pedagogy all the time. What does that look like and feel like in a school? Again, notice they bring out this idea of engaging instruction, right? Not all people are incentivized, not all people learn in the same way. So how can we give kids different ways to engage with learning content so that they can be more successful? How do we develop policies so that we have better outcomes related to disciplinary equity, AKA, how are we not over-identifying Black and Brown students, especially Black students, for exclusionary discipline practices? And then how do we teach strategies so that we as educators neutralize implicit bias, which I have just been actually reading myself, Blind Spot, Hidden Bias of Good People, which is Kent McIntosh, Dr. McIntosh mentions in some of his writing, really unpacking this idea of implicit bias and how it's nested in each of us and totally has impact on our discipline decisions as school personnel. We're gonna look at or have an opportunity to unpack key elements of policies to address discipline disproportionality, a guide for school or district teams. This is one that zeroes in on how do we really get specific about our commitment to equity? How do we develop partnerships with our families and focus on implementing Pbis through the lens of equity? How do we make our objectives around discipline procedures very clear and get feedback in an ongoing way from our stakeholders? How do we implement practices that remove or reduce exclusionary practice? How do we set up graduated discipline systems so that we have alternatives to exclusionary practices? And what procedures can we put in place so that we are accountable to student outcomes for all of our students? We're also going to look at, this was super helpful when I first became a member of this team, to understand risk ratio and risk index. So if you have some amazing data people in the group, this might be one that you have interest in. It really helps you at using problem analysis for disproportionality, and then talks about what should you do based on your data, and then how do you check to see if your plan is working. And this is the big one, right? It came out in May 2019, that cultural responsive field guide. And I'm actually going to take us through the sections of this because it's such a large document. We know that when we have culturally responsive pedagogy, that there are two types of change that we have to consider. Technical first order change, which is often procedural, which is often the first thing we do in schools, and more adaptive or second order change, which is the stuff that has real impact, but it's also the type of change that's super hard at a building or a system level. We know it's always my good friend Amy Flamini who really pushes us to think about this second order change problem and the attitudes and behaviors that predicate our ability to implement those adaptive changes. We know that some of the reasons that we gravitate to technical change first is because often if you engage in technical change, then you experience some success, and then you buy into that harder work but you cannot stay in the technical change lane, right? You have to move into secondary or second order change, adaptive change, if you really want to see equitable outcomes in your school. In fact, right, sometimes you unpack your data because you've been through training with the great Diane Lemaster, right? And you're unpacking your data and you're being thoughtful about who PBIS is working for and who it's not. But when faced with inequity in your school, sometimes you just don't know where to start. It seems overwhelming. And that's why we wanted to unpack these documents and prime your background knowledge to get you ready to work on this problem over the summer. So let's talk about that culturally responsive field guide. As I said, it's the largest of the 5 documents that we're going to talk about today. And if this is an area of work for your team, I have to stress the importance of taking this document maybe back to your universal team and taking some time to unpack it with them. So it's broken into 3 sections, and they're all meaty sections with a lot of activities that you could undergo with your teams. The first section is about identity awareness. The second is really a companion guide to your TFI, which I think would be helpful. We're taking the TFI this time of year. We might have already taken it. Now we can look at the areas of the TFI we're looking to improve and lay it next to this culturally responsive field guide to think about the activities that might improve our growth, especially when we're working with our parents and stakeholders. And then there's a whole section on the appendices. And I don't know about you, but sometimes you get overwhelmed with the document itself and you don't ever get to them. But there's some really good stuff there that we're going to talk about. So when I say identity, I'm going to unpack that section a little bit more because it's about the individual practitioner's identity, but then collectively, our individual identities together develop into our collective identity as a staff, right? In fact, if we were to talk about identity, it's super important that we think about the direct impact our individual and collective identity has on the ways that we engage with each other, on the ways we define behavior. Think about those subjective areas of the office discipline referral, defiance, disrespect, et cetera, which are always an area of work, if you will, for schools. And part of the reason defiance and disrespect is kind of a stumbling block for many teams is because we bring our individual identity into our definitions of what defiance, disrespect, et cetera, mean in our classrooms, in our school. It also impacts our individual identity, impacts the way that we interact, the way that we correct, whether it's a punishment versus a discipline or instruction practice. So our individual identity absolutely impacts how we engage with students and how we engage with each other in schools. And so within that section of the culturally responsive field guide, there's activities that if your staff would benefit from having dialogue, because this is sometimes when we bring this back to our building, it's hard to know where to start. And so if you unpack the culturally responsive field guide within the identity section, there are these different experiences or activities that you could do in a staff meeting or a PLC or a grade level meeting that might help you start to have these conversations and just make transparent how this impacts our organization. So certainly activities around raising awareness, talking about controlling for subjectivity, and then that idea of increasing family engagement through increased stakeholder input. And when we get into the TFI culturally responsive or the TFI companion guide, it'll give you some more ways in which you can increase family engagement. So inside the practitioner identity section, it really helps them think about their own cultural identities and how that impacts their work. It also gives some tools, some really, tangible ideas to take back to your staff, including cultural autobiographies, et cetera. And then how those identities play out in our discipline practices. So how does the implicit bias impact subjective behaviors, and how does this play out in our discipline data? So I talked about the TFI Companion Guide. It has a section, I'm gonna pop in here, about database decision making. So obviously we've all seen the referrals by problem behavior. It also gives us the ability, and if you have questions about this, I'm sure Diane would be willing to jump in and have a conversation, but also breaks this out by ethnicity and other ways that we can pull data. So here's an example of student referrals by ethnicity that's available within SWIS. This is why I so appreciate SWIS as opposed to some of our student information systems, because the ability to disaggregate our data is just so instantaneous. So as I mentioned, there's a TFI Companion Guide, which actually gives us non-examples and examples of what, if we're talking about 1.5, our problem behavior definitions, right? What it means to be culturally responsive when we think about those behavior definitions, including non-examples, like we use vague definitions in problem behaviors, versus examples, right? Where teams actively seek input on problem behavior definitions, especially the subjective ones like defiance and disrespect. So again, some helpful areas and activities that we can undergo, as well as examples and non-examples throughout the TFI section of the guide. There's also some activities around situational appropriateness. So I love that there's an activity that you could undergo where you could take your matrix. Let's say one of your expectations is being safe. And you can have kids engage with that and say, well, here's what being safe looks like at school versus looks like in my home versus looks like in my neighborhood, which just gives you as a teacher a window into how kids are processing this work, and just helps you be more mindful of the fact that that child's behavior might not be wrong if they were at home. That's that situational appropriateness, right? And it also gives some amazing examples of how we do a better job of engaging families in this ongoing work. So how do we get feedback from our families on a regular basis on how those expectations align with the expectations of home? Just sending home information about PBIS is not enough. We have to get our families and our community feedback on how we're implementing PBIS so that they have a sense of ownership. I love when Amy and Katie talk about the difference between involvement and engagement, because those are two different approaches to the work. So again, I apologize for the blurry, but if you go into the culturally responsive field guide breakout and you open up the document, you can see that if team composition, including families in your team, is an area of growth, there's some examples of how you can improve that on your school team. So there's also guidance around how we do a better job of implementing new policies, about how we involve people that are going to be impacted by those policies so that they are aware and can voice concerns earlier on, that we engage in ongoing training and support so that it's not just about telling, right? It's also about teaching, and how we can develop action plans to make certain that people are developing the skills necessary to implement, as well as assessing in an ongoing way how effective those things we put in place are for our students. So the last section of the culturally responsive field guide are the appendices. So in the appendices, there are a myriad of links that take us into activities to support bringing this work back to your school or district. It can help you decide how you might better plan for the coming school year. So you've taken the TFI and now you lay this down next to your TFI and start plotting out your calendar for next year. What are you going to introduce at the monthly staff meeting or at the Institute Day, etc.? And it also helps you think through what additional supports that you might need. So as we think about which tools might be helpful to your practice, I'm going to open up a breakout room. It is 2:36. When I open this up, one of my friends is going to drop a PowerPoint into, I'm going to stop sharing really quick. When I open up the breakout rooms, there'll be a breakout room for each of the documents I walk through. So using discipline data, the field guide, the 5-point intervention, etc. And you can self-select yourself into the breakout room that you think would be most helpful to your practice. When you do that, oh, someone already dropped. When you do that, let me go out so you can see my notes. When you do that, you're going to open up, pardon me, tell me if you don't see a PowerPoint that says key elements of policy. Thank you very much, Katie. So each of these breakout rooms has a slide, and I'm going to ask that it's dropped in there. And then if you click on the title, you'll actually be able to open up the document. Here's how we're going to spend the next 17 minutes of our life. So I want you to get into your breakout rooms. I want you to open up the document, and I want you to take the first 5 minutes together to actually walk through the document on your own. Jot your own notes, your own major takeaways, and then you're going to elect someone in your group to be your note taker and someone to be your reporter outer, right? So you're going to spend the first 5 minutes opening the document. If I was in key elements of policy, I would click on the link. It would open the document. Myself and my other peers would take 5 minutes to walk through the document, noting any key takeaways. And then someone would be your scribe. So if Missy was reporting out on her big takeaway, and Diane and Amy and Katie and I was scribing, I would just pop bullets into that PowerPoint. And then when we come back from our breakout room, you need a reporter outer to share the major takeaways of your group. Does that make sense? So we're going to go out into breakouts. We're going to have 5 minutes to review the document on our own quietly. And then we're going to have a scribe keep track of the notes from our group. And we're going to have a reporter outer when we come back together to report out on the major takeaways. So we are going to take until 3 p.m., which gives you your 5 minutes of reading and reviewing, and then 15 minutes together to come away with your major takeaways. And then we'll come back together at 3 o'clock and share out. We'll walk through the rest of the upcoming announcements, and then we'll go into technical assistance after our break. Are there any questions from the group before I open the breakouts? Perfecto. You should see a pop-up where you can choose the breakout that you think would benefit your practice the most. And I will close the rooms at 3 p.m.
Tricia, we'll put a reminder in the notes in every breakout room about their tasks.
Thank you, ma'am.
If anybody cannot select your room, just let us know and we can get you in there. If you can't self-select, we can get you in.
When we started, and then the time just gets away from you, right?
Julie, I'm missing your fashion in person because I'm pretty sure Zoom doesn't do it justice.
No kidding.
Well, thank you. I'm wearing a lemony colored joggers today with lavender suede pumps.
Oh, nice.
Wowza.
I'm sure all the others really care.
I'm sure everyone, right?
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back.
I just saw Matt Radcliffe on here from Indianapolis Public. Welcome, Matt.
Rock on. So that group that was working on policies. So Jackie, Julie, Katie, who was your reporter outer? Who is willing to share with us kind of some takeaways from that group?
I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me just pull up my slide real quick. So this document was a document where we think that the primary audience would be potentially your school board or people who influence the school board. It talks about 7 key elements for equity policies. So it goes very specifically into these 7 elements, and what you'd want to consider for each, gives you examples and non-examples. And then at the end, there's sort of something that I thought that you might be able to use as like a self-assessment to see like which of these you're fully implementing, which of these you're not. And even though I'm not on our school board, I was thinking it might be something that my team, my supervisor, and peers could look at and kind of think like, which of these do we want to sort of like bring to our, to the attention of the higher ups, and so that we can advocate for change.
Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing. How about someone who was in the engaging instruction? I know a good group of you guys wanted to be in engaging instruction.
I could share for our group. My name is Samantha. I'm in Los Angeles, California, and we were engaging instruction. I'm just pulling it up. I'm sorry. Okay, so we just talked about, or what we were looking at was just ways to make instruction engaging with teachers, and how leaders and coaches and such can support with that. So just making sure that there's explicit instruction, so you're clarifying, clarifying the objectives and expectations. Derek mentioned building background to create foundation, and increasing opportunities to respond equals increased engagement, and then providing opportunities to correct misunderstandings, and with that you inform progress. So we kind of looked at those 4 pieces that go in with engaging instruction.
Thank you so much. I appreciated that little star where you said teachers and leaders must believe all students can learn, right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Fisher and Fry has been putting out a lot of information since we've been in distance learning. Clarifying your expectations and objectives has always been important, right? Behaviorally, academically, but certainly now more than ever. That's totally necessary. How about using discipline data?
There we are. Sorry, I was trying to find that unmute button. Using discipline data, so it goes through a kind of a 4-step process and problem solving some of the things you see. So the first one is identification. What are the trends that you're seeing? And then problem analysis, which is why is it happening, right? Let's figure out, interpret why this trend is happening right now. Plan that implementation. So what are we going to do in response, right? And maybe that's where things are happening. Maybe that's a certain behavior that you see that's happening, and maybe it's not always with students, but maybe it's with the adults as well. And then plan our, we have our response and what we're going to do. We type out that plan, but then we got to check on that. Is this what we put in, this professional development we did, this strategy we're using, is that having an effect on that data that we had seen last time? And one of the really cool parts of that document was the risk ratio process and the data, and not just looking overall what is, our disproportionality, but let's dig deeper into specifically that subgroup. What percentage of students in the Latino subgroup are being suspended? We have a high percentage there. Compare that to that same type of percentage with other racial groups. And that comes out with that risk ratio analysis. And that was some good data to dig deeper in asking the why question. Drilling down that data, and when we drill it down, let's determine, are these trends showing maybe explicit biases or implicit biases, so that we can know how we want to respond. And self-reflection on systems. Is this something, if we see that trend, is this something our system has set up? Or is this, again, maybe individuals are struggling with this type of student. And I had a question. I am familiar with the Aurid process. It seems very familiar. And my question was, is this very just similar to it, and maybe how that might be different? So that was just a dig deeper question I have for myself.
What is the Aurid process?
Yes.
I don't know, what is that process?
What is it? It's the same type of process. Aurid stands for objective. What do you see? What sticks out to you? R is reflective. How does it make you feel when you see that data and you see those numbers and the disproportionality? Interpretive is the I. Again, that's the why are these things happening? Let's interpret what's going on. And then the D is decision. What is our decision that we're responding to? How are we going to change what we're doing to move on and have an effect on those numbers?
So you could almost do a Venn diagram of the overlap, right, between the Aurid and this. I think this zooms in very intentionally around disproportionality and how PBIS is working for all of our kids, not just overall, but individually. Who is it working for and who's it not working for? But certainly, I don't think that this process would negate anything related to the Aurid process. I think it actually might complement. It might help you think through, you know, what data you want to look at, right?
Oh, I would agree.
Okay, so how about the 5-point intervention group?
All right, that was our group. So this article, which was pretty short, I felt like it was maybe like an introductory summary. And then every other article seems to be a little deeper analysis of those points that we were looking at. And that is one of the things we said about the article, like, oh, I'd like to learn more about this, but that was only a paragraph. And I like what another group said in terms of who is the audience for this article. I had not thought of that, but I really do think a school board or a leadership group would be a great audience because it is an easy read and it'd be a nice starting point. So 5 points of intervention in terms of discipline equity. The first point was make sure you have a data system where you can drill down and you could disaggregate discipline data by those subgroups. We talked in our group about how important that was, and keeping in mind, seeing that disproportionality doesn't tell you what to do, but it just brings to the forefront, we have a problem here. You know, now we could go deeper with it. They talked about having a behavior framework and specifically about PBIS. And we talked on how we see PBIS as a framework for adults. It is about making sure we're on the same page and being consistent and treating our kids the same way. So important that we remind ourselves in our schools, raffles are really great, but the point of PBIS is making sure all the adults are consistent with our kids. We also brought up something all of us in our group were experiencing. We don't have enough of the right people at the table for making decisions. Just even in terms of looking at your school values and expectations, we are struggling to get parents around the table, to get different cultures represented, to make sure we are being all inclusive. So one was engaging instruction to reduce the opportunity gap. We were like, oh, we wouldn't need more ideas about that, as well as for neutralizing implicit bias in discipline decisions. It's a huge area of our focus. We also know that this is a very scary area to bring up at your school. How you do it and who you have do it is very, very important. Having someone come in, sometimes a more neutral party, may go a long way versus the principal starting this discussion. And then developing policies with accountability for disciplinary equity. We took that right under the framework as well, that the behavioral framework.
Perfect. Thank you, Missy.
Mhm.
Okay, the big one. Who got to be the reporter outer for the field guide?
Hi there, I'm Nicole, Springfield, Illinois, and our team definitely had the opportunity to skim and kind of look at nuggets of it. So we'll offer you what our discussion was. Really, the field guide started out with stressing the importance, and the whole first section was about understanding our personal identities and their impact in order to be able to support and lead and teach with cultural responsiveness in the classroom and in our schools. This document really, we felt were for teams, our school teams, several different teams could really look at and benefit at the practitioner level from the content, but really lots of ideas about putting practical, actual strategies in practice for action planning to support equity goals and different equity issues that we're working on in our schools. This field guide, culturally responsive field guide, is aligned to the TFI, so a tool that our behavior teams are already familiar with, so we'll help the team to grow in certain areas that we've identified for improvement. The appendices, the whole field guide itself, but particularly the appendices, include activities for action planning and several resources for action planning. We pulled out as connected to the first point with personal identity and the importance for educators to understand ourselves as we lead and teach others, is the importance of understanding and appreciating diversity in our schools and in our students. And one of our group members talked about the importance of seeing color is a way to recognize diversity in our schools. And when people say they don't see color, it's really not reflective of understanding and appreciating diversity. So we felt that was important to note. And then last but not least, as far as a next step, we talked about the integration of this tool with the TFI. It is a companion and a great resource, but we were talking about perhaps the next step would be how to integrate it so it lives in the same place and same document at the same time. And we understand we could look at it before we did the TFI or after, but we just talked about the importance of having it right there to not only be able to align, but that it would be integrated.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I bet after, right, when those of you who had the culture responsive field guide, you could have spent an hour in that breakout room, right? Unpacking the different sections. But I hope that you got enough of the flavor from each of the documents to see, oh, this one would be helpful to my team's practice. And that I also appreciated Missy and others talking about the different audiences, like, oh, these short, brief ones might be really helpful as an intro, right? You probably wouldn't want to unpack the whole culture responsive field guide in a staff meeting, right? Maybe you start with one of the shorter articles and then do breakouts, etc. So I hope that this afternoon, us kind of walking you through those different documents will be helpful, and you'll have found some activities or a resource to use with your teams. I'm going to go ahead and go back in just to walk us through the rest of our learning for this afternoon, and then we will jump into our technical assistance after our break. So let me go back up. My apologies. So as we jump into our updates and reminders, the very first one I want to give you is thank you, thank you, thank you. We've had over 50 school districts that have already applied for recognition. And you applied for recognition in the state of Illinois, if you're from here, for badges this year, right? Because we're not going to expect fidelity of implementation this year around gold or silver. You're applying for individual badges. And we've seen some amazing pieces of evidence of how you've worked this year to implement Pbis in this very different context, whether it be remote or hybrid or the 5 different learning models that you've implemented this year. So now we're going to ask you to tell your story if you have interest in another way, and we would help. I hope this is going to. So we received word that this new administration is looking for the stories from the field of how schools have been implementing practices during the last year, especially. And so I linked in here, although please know that we would be available to support you. Whether you've already implemented and turned in your recognition, or whether you just should feel proud, frankly, of the hard work that you've done with your teams this year, we'd like to help you submit your story as a district to the U.S. Department of Education. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but basically they're looking for examples from the field. So schools or districts that have really been trying to target safe, healthy learning environments. And the district sends in a description, attaches things. So let's say I had some great tier 1 examples around updating your expectations, how you teach those expectations, how you reinforce those expectations. All you'd need to do is take those things that you turned in for recognition and write a couple sentences around the shift that you made this year, and then you would submit to the Department of Education. So think about that activity I asked you to start with, where you were going to acknowledge someone who was doing good work. Can you imagine, especially given all the hard work that we've faced this year, how grateful that your staff would feel in being recognized by this new administration? So the link is in the PowerPoint. If you would like more information, please reach out to us. We would be more than willing to set up a Zoom call to help you tell your story. We want to help celebrate you and all the hard work that you've done together this year. I'm going to go back here.
Tricia, when is that due?
It's due on a rolling basis, Missy. It's why I emailed you this morning.
That's what I
So we want to help you tell your story. We don't tell our stories. We should tell our stories so that people can recognize all the hard work that's happened this year. As a reminder, we have one more Coaches Network meeting together. That is May 10th. The registration is already open. We hope that you will join us. In addition, we still have some hot topics to help support you through the end of this school year. They are up and available on the website. As a reminder, they're 75 minutes. It's not a sit and get. It really is come to us with your questions, your problems. We'll work with you to address the roadblocks that you're facing as a team. And then upcoming training. I get to work with a team around FBA and BIP with the great Amy Flamini this week. I know that I think it's Katie, maybe Diane, that are doing tier 1 leadership and readiness. There's still some training occurring between now and the end of the school year if it would be beneficial to your practice. As I said, we're always here to support you. So if you're interested in telling your school or your district's story, please send an email to either us or that support@midwestpbis.org email, and we will set up a time to help you. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And I know Amy, bless her heart, has been ad nauseum adding the exit slip to the chat. Ad nauseum.
I have one job today, and it's to make sure you fill out that exit slip.
We try to take your feedback and improve each time we come together, but we can only do that if you give us your feedback. So there's 3 breakouts for technical assistance. We are going to take our break, but what we could do is go ahead and get in these breakouts, and then we'll turn off our cameras for 5 minutes, go get something to drink. It is 3:20. I'm going to ask that you pick either equity, so we can continue to have this conversation around equity, or district planning, or family engagement. You will self-select yourself into one of those rooms. If you have trouble doing that, please just add which of these topics you would be interested in joining next to your name, and we'll help you get in those rooms. And we will start up technical assistance at 3:25. So jump in your breakout, then turn off your camera, take 5 minutes, get a drink of water. We'll come back together at 3:25.